So let's start off looking at the commandments of God. As you know, only sin can keep us out of heaven. And so we need to know what is a sin and what isn't a sin. Oftentimes, even we traditional Catholics tend to think that the Ten Commandments are just a bunch of do's and don'ts that God's put there just to make life miserable for us. That's because we don't understand the principles that underlie each of the commandments. So, if we try to look at these principles, we'll realize that the commandments do make sense and God really does know what he's talking about after all, and that he really is looking out only for our own welfare. So we're going to have this series of 3 conferences on the 10 Commandments. We'll have 2 of these conferences tonight and then 1 tomorrow evening. Right now we're going to take a look at the first 3 commandments, 1, 2, and 3. The first commandment is, I am the Lord thy God, thou shalt not have strange gods before me. The principle here is pretty obvious, that God deserves the worship of our entire being, your body and your soul, with its faculties, your intellect, and your will. Now, there's another second principle involved in the first commandments. Deliberately to place your Catholic faith in danger is going to be offensive to God, venially or mortally, depending upon the danger that you're putting your faith in. Now, those are the principles. Let's take a look and see how those principles work out in our daily lives. As you know, deliberately to refuse to believe any doctrine of the Catholic Church is a mortal sin of heresy. To take an active part in a non-Catholic service is a mortal sin of false worship. Now, it is tolerated for a Catholic to passively attend a wedding or a funeral of a non-Catholic relative, friend, co-worker even. In this case, you're there not for the false worship, but to show your moral support for your loved one. And in this case, the best idea is to sit, stand, whatever everyone else is doing, preferably at the back of the church if you possibly can, and then do your own Catholic prayers like your rosary or whatever, while they're doing their false worship. Now, with that, please note, there is an exception here. It is not allowed for a Catholic to be a best man or maid of honor at a non-Catholic wedding, because that is active participation in false worship. Now, indifferentism is the belief that all religions are equal and that the Holy Ghost uses all religions as means to get souls to heaven. Now, by its nature, indifferentism is, of course, objectively a mortal sin. However, nowadays, because of the crisis of the church and because of the bad education, even in the modern Catholic parochial school system, oftentimes people have not been taught the truth. And as a result, a lot of people nowadays, they have ignorance and invincible ignorance oftentimes with regards to this issue, so that oftentimes for them it may not be a mortal sin subjectively. Reading religious books by non-Catholic authors or listening to non-Catholic preachers like on the radio or TV, this will frequently be offensive to God, mortally or venially, depending upon the danger that you're putting your faith into. Now, sometimes a person will say, but Father, I'm just listening to the Baptist preacher on the radio, and what they're saying isn't heretical. They're just talking about Scripture. What I would say is, first of all, even though you may not be catching the heresies, if a Catholic priest were to listen to it, he might be catching the heresies there. So there is a danger there. But even in the case where the Protestant preacher is not spouting out direct heresies, still, remember, the Holy Ghost does not directly speak through non-Catholic preachers. We also have to be careful about listening to modern Catholic radio, TV programs, etc. Sometimes, I will admit, even sometimes nowadays, some of the Catholic stuff, new Catholic stuff out there can be okay. It's not dangerous, but then some of it really is. So oftentimes it's a combination of the good, the bad, and the ugly. So you have to be very careful when you do listen to any of these modern Catholic programs. Superstition, fortune-telling, horoscopes, interpreting dreams. These will be offensive to God. Mortally sinful only in the case where you really believe it to be divine. Normally it's going to be probably a venial sin because of curiosity, etc. Let's give an example. Let's say that you've got a rabbit's foot on your keychain. Now, if you believe that this rabbit's foot is some divine object that is infallibly going to keep you safe, obviously you're turning into a false god, and that's going to be a mortal sin. Usually, however, if a traditional Catholic is stupid enough, oh, did I say that? If a traditional Catholic is stupid enough to have a rabbit's foot on their keychain, it's usually simply a matter of curiosity or frivolity. That's why this will be venially sinful. Now remember, venial sins do offend God. Not as much as mortal sins, but they do offend him. That's why if you've got a rabbit's foot on your keychain, get rid of it. Now, Spiritism, for example, the use of the Ouija board or tarot cards, etc., this is mortally sinful because it really is calling on demons. To neglect saying any kind of prayer for more than a month at a time will be a mortal sin because God deserves our daily worship. Deliberately neglecting to make the sign of the cross through human respect will be a venial sin. This is usually the case of guys at work, right? We've probably all been there, done that. You're working with a lot of non-Catholics, Protestants, etc. It's lunchtime, and you know that you should be saying your grace before meals, but you're so embarrassed. You're thinking, oh my gosh, if I make the sign of the cross, everyone's going to laugh at me. So what do? You do something like this. That's cheating, okay? Now, then we can mention about two sins, presumption and despair. Let's give a couple examples. Presumption is the case of, even if I die in mortal sin, God's still good enough that he's going to take me straight to heaven. Whereas despair is the opposite. I am so evil that not even God can forgive me my sins. Now, these two sins by their nature are going to be mortally offensive to God. However, oftentimes there is a lack of sufficient reflection or full consent of the will, so that oftentimes, subjectively, they'll be venial. Desecrating a Roman Catholic church or a cemetery by committing a grave sin there is a second mortal sin of sacrilege. Also, to receive any of the sacraments of the living, for example, Holy Communion, confirmation, or matrimony, when you know that you're in the state of mortal sin, that also adds another mortal sin of sacrilege. Now, sometimes people will say, but Father, I know I'm in the state of mortal sin, I know that I shouldn't be receiving communion, but what's everyone going to think of me if I don't receive communion? I'm going to be so embarrassed. Now, there is one thing that you can do in this case. You can come up to the communion rail and then discreetly put a finger over your lips. That way the priest will know not to give you communion. He'll simply give you a blessing instead. And only the priest will notice this. No one else will notice it. So that you will you won't be causing wonder to anyone. They won't be scandalized. And you won't be embarrassed by it. So that's a good way of making sure that you don't offend God by a sacrilegious communion. Let's go on to the second commandment now. Thou shalt not take the name of the Lord thy God in vain. Firstly, I'd like to make a distinction between two sins, blasphemy and taking God's name in vain. Because oftentimes even traditional Catholics tend to mix these up, and they are really different. Blasphemy is perhaps the very worst sin possible because it comes from hatred of God. This is a direct assault on God. It's trying to slap God, our Lord Jesus Christ, the Blessed Virgin Mary, or the saints of the Catholic Church, or even Christianity generally. It's trying to slap God in the face. So to give a couple bad examples of blasphemy, you can think of some of the movies that come out nowadays, like The Last Temptation of Christ or the Da Vinci Code. These are trying to be offensive to God. That's why this is extremely mortally sinful. Whereas taking God's name in vain is different. This does not come from hatred of God, but comes from impatience, annoyance, etc. This is the use of the name God, Lord, Jesus Christ, or either of those two names. Some cultures also use the name of the Blessed Virgin Mary or some saint, not as a prayer, but as an expression of annoyance, anger, impatience. Now, because it proceeds from impatience and not from hatred, taking God's name in vain is by nature a venial sin, which is why it's very different from blasphemy. Now, we can also mention irreverence. This is, for example, telling jokes about a holy person or a holy thing. This will oftentimes be venial. We can also mention a question that is obliquely related to this, the question of vulgarities, vulgar words. Oftentimes this will be a venial sin against fraternal charity, because people who are relatively cultured are offended by the use of these words. Now, cursing is the use of the word damn, as in damn it or damn so-and-so. Now, if you really want someone to burn in hell, obviously you're committing a mortal sin against fraternal charity. Usually, however, when someone says damn it, they usually are simply expressing annoyance, impatience. This is going to be a venial sin. Now, as we said before, venial sins do offend God, so we do want to erase this word from our vocabulary. Perjury is lying on oath, for example, in a court of law. By its nature, perjury will be a mortal sin, unless it's in such a very small way that it could possibly become venial. When confessing sins of perjury, you also need to confess what kind of damage was done by the perjury. For example, if you destroyed someone's reputation by telling lies about them in a court of law, or if you did damage to someone's business or finances because of the lie you told under oath. Then I'd like to make a distinction between three things: resolutions, promises, and vows, because they are very different. A resolution does not bind under pain of any sin. Let's give an example. Let's say that you make a resolution to say your daily rosary as a family, which, by the way, is a very good kind of resolution you should all be making. But even if you deliberately neglect your resolution, you're not directly offending God by it. Maybe indirectly because of spiritual laziness, but not directly. Whereas a promise normally binds us under pain of venial sin, which is why it's very appropriate for parents to teach your children always to keep the promises that they've made to their friends, as long as the object of the promise, of course, isn't something sinful. Whereas the third thing, a vow, is radically different. A vow is a sacred promise made to God. And that's why, by its nature, it's going to oblige under pain of mortal sin, unless it's broken in such a very small way that it could possibly become venial. Now, if you are ever thinking of making a vow, make sure that you speak to a priest first before you end up doing something stupid. Because sometimes people have a tendency to make vows for the least small thing. Usually it happens in a moment of spiritual exaltation, and it's usually accompanied by hyperventilation. Something like this: "Oh Jesus, I love you so much that I vow that I'm going to have only bread and water for all the rest of the Fridays of my life." And then Friday comes around, goes very well for about 2 weeks, and then the Friday comes around again, and suddenly you realize that you want to eat chicken. Obviously, you're not able to keep this stupid vow. The actual word in theology books is actually rash vow. We priests call them stupid vows. So if you've ever had the temptation to make a stupid vow, if you've ever made a stupid vow, make sure you speak to a priest about it, because fortunately Holy Mother Church does understand human weakness and has given to her priest the possibility of either commuting, that means changing the vow, or dispensing, that means taking it away from you entirely so you don't have to worry about it again. So if you've ever made a stupid vow, make sure you speak to a priest about it. Of course, we're not speaking about marriage vows. Going on to the third commandment, keep holy the Lord's Day. The principle here is that God has given us 6 days on which to work, and he's reserved for himself 1 day for his worship. Therefore, we owe it to God to worship him in the way that he wants, on the day that he wants. Now, that's the principle. Let's see how that works out in our day-to-day life. Deliberately to miss Mass on a Sunday or a holy day of obligation is a mortal sin. Now please note I say deliberately, because sometimes a person comes into confession and says, "Bless you, Father, for I have sinned. Father, I missed Mass on Sunday." And the priest is thinking, "Ooh, mortal sin." And then the priest asks, so what happened? Why did you miss it? "Because I was sick." Well, obviously, that's not deliberate. Now, if you mention it at confession, you tell the priest that it was indeliberate. But if it's deliberate, it will be mortally sinful. Likewise, if you deliberately cause someone else, for example, your children, to miss Mass on a Sunday or holy day of obligation, that's another mortal sin also. What about leaving Mass early or coming to Mass late? We're talking only about Sundays and holy days of obligation here, obviously. Now, if you come in deliberately late after the beginning of the offertory, so that's after the sermon, after the creed, the priest takes off the chalice veil, that's the beginning of the offertory. If you're not there by that time, then you have not fulfilled your Sunday obligation. And if you were living in a place where there were more than just one Mass on a Sunday, let's say you were living in Wanganui, let's say, and you missed you came in late for the first Mass, you'd have the obligation to go to one of the later Masses in the day to make sure that you fulfilled your Sunday obligation. Also, if you deliberately leave Mass before the priest's communion, that also means that you have not fulfilled the Sunday obligation. Now, there are times, however, where it is allowed to miss a Sunday Mass. And here it's important to understand that there's two distinct laws. There is a divine law, that means it comes from God himself. That's the third commandment. Now, what does the third commandment say? Does it say to go to Mass? It says, keep Sunday holy. It doesn't say to go to Mass. Note that. Whereas there's an ecclesiastical law of the church, that's a church law that's a man-made law. And it says, go to Mass on Sundays and holy days. So now that's important to realize the distinction between these two laws, because there are times when you are excused from an ecclesiastical law of the church. In other words, you may be excused from attending Mass on Sunday, but you're still obliged to God's law to keep Sunday holy in whatever way you can. So you can be excused from the ecclesiastical law of the church by either physical impossibility or moral impossibility. Let's give a couple examples. Physical impossibility. Let's say that you or someone in your family, one of your kids, is sick on Sunday. Obviously, you're excused from Mass attendance. Now, you still have to keep Sunday holy, though, but you are excused from Mass attendance. Now, likewise, if you are living at a great distance, the old theologian said that if you have to drive more than 1 hour each way to Mass, the obligation of Mass attendance actually no longer exists. Obviously, we encourage and certainly commend the faithful who do make all that distance in order to get to Mass. But in fact, the obligation no longer exists. Likewise, for extreme weather conditions. Let's say that you are living up in the Southern Alps somewhere, and suddenly there's a big blizzard on Sunday morning, and you've got 8 feet of snow. Well, obviously, you're excused from going to Mass because it's of the physical impossibility because of the weather conditions. Now, besides the physical impossibility, there can also be moral impossibility, where attendance at Mass would actually be dangerous to your Catholic faith. And you know where I'm going with this, don't you? The Novus Ordo Missae. With regards to the Novus Ordo, let's give a couple examples. Let's say that I go to a Novus Ordo Mass that's totally outrageous, a clown Mass or a rock and roll Mass. Now, this is so offensive to God that, of course, I'm going to be committing a mortal sin that way. But even if I were to go to a pious, reverent Novus Ordo Mass, where the priest is doing all the right rubrics, he's saying all the right prayers, etc., still, the Novus Ordo has been so watered down and so Protestantized that I'm going to be committing some kind of venial sin against God this way by attending it. That's why Archbishop Lefebvre even used to say that because the Novus Ordo has been so watered down and Protestantized, it doesn't fulfill the Sunday obligation anyway. So that's why, if you are, let's say, in a place where you can't get to a traditional Mass, or maybe you're on a business trip or vacation somewhere where there's no traditional Mass around, you are excused from Mass attendance. Do not go to the Novus Ordo Mass because God does not want you committing even a venial sin against him. He would rather you say your prayers in your motel, hotel, wherever you're at, and that way you're pleasing him by keeping Sunday holy. Now, please note that when we do speak about this, we are not judging the Novus Ordo priests or the faithful who go to the Novus Ordo. God knows that there's a big crisis in the church out there, and that many people in the Novus Ordo really are confused, and they're trying to do their best. God will be merciful to them, but to us, as traditional Catholics, God's given you and me bigger graces. We know better, and that's why God will hold us accountable. Now, when you are excused from Mass attendance because of either physical or moral impossibility, you still have to keep Sunday holy in whatever way you can. If you're able to pray your rosary, read your missal, do some spiritual reading, or make a meditation, you do that. Now, obviously, if you're running a temperature of 104 degrees Fahrenheit, sorry, I don't know the Celsius, that's be 40 something, I suppose. So if you're running a very high temperature and you're beginning to hallucinate, obviously you're not going to be able to pray your rosary. You simply offer up your sufferings, and in that way, you're keeping Sunday holy. Now, with regards to the Eucharistic fast, as you know, it's now officially 1 hour before receiving communion. But when Pope Pius XII brought in the 3-hour fast back in 1957, he specifically stipulated that the midnight fast is still the norm. And even oftentimes we traditional Catholics tend to forget this. Now, obviously, if you are coming to, like this week, evening Mass, or even, let's say, a late morning Mass, yeah, a 3-hour fast is obviously going to be okay. Now, if you're going to an early morning Mass, though, if you can keep the midnight fast, that would obviously be the best, because we want to be giving more to God rather than less. Now, I can also understand certain cases where the 1-hour fast could be legitimate, especially in the case of someone with health issues, particularly, let's say, diabetes or hypoglycemia. They might need to make use of that 1-hour fast. I could understand that. Communion in the hand, of course, is objectively going to be wrong. However, because of the bad advice of bishops and priests now for the last 40 years, oftentimes the faithful are subjectively guiltless due to inculpable ignorance. Servile work is the work that used to be done by servants or slaves. Now, servile work is either unnecessary or necessary. Now, if it is unnecessary, it's going to be offensive to God. For example, if you mow your lawn on a Sunday when you could have done it on Saturday or some other weekday evening, you are offending God. Now, if you're spending 2.5 hours or more of a Sunday in servile work, this is going to be mortally sinful, because 2.5 hours is considered a big part of the day that we're supposed to be giving to God. Less than 2.5 hours would be a venial sin, because it's considered a small part of the day. Now, there are things that are unnecessary, even though we enjoy them. For example, even though you might experience personal fulfillment from digging ditches in your backyard, still it's unnecessary, and that's why it will be sinful. But however, there is also necessary servile work. For example, cooking on a Sunday or doing the dishes afterwards. No problem with that. That is necessary servile work. Then there are also other occupations which may feel like hard labor, which are actually allowed on Sundays. For example, filling out your tax reports on a Sunday. Even though it feels like hard labor, it is actually allowed. What about laundry? Nowadays, it's the machine that does the laundry, not you doing it at the scrub board anymore. As a result, strictly speaking, it's not sinful to do laundry on Sundays, but we do encourage the faithful to avoid it in order to keep the spirit of the law and not just the letter. What about shopping? If it's unnecessary, it will be a venial sin. However, if it's necessary, then there won't be any sin at all. For example, let's say you get up on a Sunday morning and realize that you've run out of milk for your children. No problem with going down to the local dairy and picking up a gallon of liter or whatever you call it here, of milk for the kids. That's okay. But you don't want to be doing the rest of your weekly shopping at the same time if you can possibly avoid it. Then there are times when going to work on a Sunday or holy day of obligation is simply necessary, in which case, of course, there's no sin. Then there are other cases when working on a Sunday or holy day of obligation may not be strictly necessary, but it could be very helpful for family finances. In this case, it is wise to speak to your priest for his advice. Honor thy father and thy mother. Firstly, let's take a look at sins of children towards their parents. Disobedience and disrespect will almost always be venial sins. However, there are 3 cases where a mortal sin can be committed. Firstly, in the case of grave disobedience. Now, the typical example of this is a teenager who sneaks out of the house to go on a date without mom and dad's permission. Now, this is going to be grave because the parents have the right and the obligation to know where and with whom their children are. Second case is grave dishonor being given to the parents. Typical case here is a teenager or young adult who slaps a parent in the face. Now, please note I say teenager or young adult, because sometimes you'll get a little kid who comes up to you and smacks you and says, "I hate you, mommy." Well, obviously the little child's not really thinking about what it's saying and doing. It is going to be venial and does need to be corrected, but it's radically different from the case of a teenager or young adult who know what they're doing. The third case is grave grief that's being given to one's parents through their immoral behavior. Again, we're talking teenagers, young adults. This is going to be mortally sinful. But let's also take a look at the sins of parents concerning their children. To give bad example to one's children by staying away from the sacraments for a long time is easily a mortal sin. Also, to neglect the baptism or confirmation of a child, likewise mortal. Also, to neglect the Catholic education of one's children would be mortal sin. In the old Code of Canon Law, it was strictly forbidden for Catholic parents to send their children to a public school because of all the dangers to the faith there. Now, it was only tolerated with the express permission of the local bishop. Now, the new Code of Canon Law has unfortunately dropped this prohibition. Nevertheless, there are times when the only option left is to send a child to a public school, especially if you don't have a Catholic school, a good Catholic school available nearby. That's understandable. But in this case, it is wise to speak to your priest about it so that the priest can give good instructions, good encouragement, how to be able to navigate through the public school system without losing one's soul. To prevent a child from following a religious vocation would likewise be a mortal sin on the part of the parent. Also, to neglect telling the facts of life suitable to the age, the key words there are suitable to the age, would easily become a mortal sin. The old phrase was, better a year too early than a day too late. This is very true because once innocence is lost, it's lost forever. And you do not want your children finding certain things out from the local neighborhood children. To fail to correct the faults of one's children can become sinful. If your children, and we're talking only about the children who are minors living at home under your parental roof still, of course. So if your children are committing mortal sins, obviously you've got an obligation to correct them. Usually, however, it's a case of venial sins, and you want to avoid 2 extremes. You want to avoid jumping down their throat at every least thing that only discourages them. On the other hand, you want to avoid letting them get away with the proverbial murder, because obviously that's not going to help either. So moderation in all things. You have to pick your battles wisely. To reassure you, however, corporal punishment is by its nature okay. I don't know what the laws, civil laws in New Zealand are regarding corporal punishment. It could easily be like it is in America, where you could practically be thrown in the pokey for slapping your child. Anyway, just to reassure you though, corporal punishment is okay in itself, in moderation, because remember, children learn through their senses. You see this in a case of, let's say, take 2-year-old Johnny. 2-year-old Johnny has to see everything, he has to hear everything, he has to experience everything. So there's 2-year-old Johnny. He feels the leg of the coffee table. He feels the top of the coffee table. He feels the ashtray on top of the coffee table. And he feels the ashes in the ashtray. He's learning through the sense of touch. And then what does 2-year-old Johnny do? He tastes the ashes. He's learning through the sense of taste. That's why while mommy comes along and sees what little 2-year-old Johnny's doing, she gives little Johnny a smack on the hand. And that he's learning through the sense of touch that he's not supposed to do that. So that's why, in and of itself, corporal punishment is okay in moderation. Now, it may be necessary at times to kick a teenager or young adult out of the house, especially in the case if they're giving grave scandal to younger siblings. This is, however, a very difficult decision to make, and it's wise, if you ever are in this situation, it's wise to speak to your priest first to make sure that you're not making a mistake. There is a very important principle for parents here. It goes like this. Parents are responsible for the sins committed by your children when they're still minors living under your parental roof, if you could have prevented them. Now that is so serious, I'm going to repeat it for you. Parents are responsible for the sins committed by your children if you could have prevented them. Well, Father, you're saying that because you don't understand, because you don't have kids. The same kind of thing applies to the priest. It's a little bit different. For us, it goes like this. Priests are responsible for the sins committed by our faithful, if by our preaching and exhortations we could have prevented your sins. So don't complain. The priest has the bigger burden, I promise you. Now, where many parents unfortunately fail is with regards to occasions of sin. And there's 2 areas in particular. Firstly, regarding the media. For example, television, music, books, internet, magazines, etc. One has to be very careful what you allow in the house. We'll be talking more about this Wednesday night in sermon number 7. The other area, the second area of occasions of sin, is going to be dating rules. Now, oftentimes, if you were to ask the typical modern teenager, what's the idea behind dating? They tell you it's a wonderful opportunity for a great smooch fest. Wrong. Dating is meant as a preparation for the sacrament of matrimony, and therefore there are rules concerning dating. For a young man may not begin dating until he is financially capable of supporting a wife and child. If a man's going into a profession, let's say he's going into college, maybe by the time he's 21, a year away from getting his bachelor's degree, and he's got a job lined up for himself right out of college, yeah, maybe at that point he could start dating. Or a young man who's going into a trade right out of high school, then perhaps if he's 18, if he's making enough money to be able to support a family, yes, perhaps at that point he could. A young lady simply needs to have the emotional maturity for motherhood. Most girls, I think, by the time that they're 18, do have that emotional maturity. Not that I would suggest that they run after the first Joe six-pack who comes across their way, though. If these criteria are not met and a young person begins dating before being ready to get married, it is ordinarily going to be, and I say ordinarily, not always, ordinarily going to be a mortal sin because of the occasion of sin involved. Now, however, we can say that teenagers in general are forbidden to date. However, teenagers are obviously social beings and they need to be around people their own age, preferably around those of the same gender. But in any case, there must be no pairing off before they're ready for the sacrament of matrimony. Let's mention a couple other issues which are obliquely associated with the 4th commandment. Firstly, gambling. In and of itself, there's no problem with gambling. It can only become sinful if you recklessly endanger family finances by it. And, to state the obvious, to join a communist society or the Freemasons is, of course, a mortal sin. Going on to the 5th commandment now, thou shalt not kill. The principle here is pretty obvious, that God is the author of life, and therefore only he has sovereign rights over its use. And that is why birth control, abortion, sterilization, in vitro fertilization, euthanasia, or cooperation in any of these sins is by its very nature going to be gravely offensive to God. Moreover, with the sin of abortion, there is also an excommunication attached, not only to the one who has the abortion done, but to anyone who even cooperates in procuring an abortion. Now, to incur any kind of excommunication, one has to know ahead of time that this sin is punished in a specific way by the Catholic Church. And in the specific case of abortion, it must be certain that the abortion actually took place. For example, in the case of what's called the morning after pill, there is no certainty that an abortion actually took place. Therefore, there's no excommunication attached to it, though obviously it is a very mortal sin. With regards to the sin of sterilization, because this is also a sin of injustice against one's spouse, there's actually a grave obligation to have the sterilization reversed if it's still possible. Sometimes there are circumstances that prevent the reversal, though. And if you're ever in doubt about this, it's always wise to speak to a priest. Deliberately, and please note I do say deliberately, to cause a miscarriage would be a mortal sin. Regarding the means of preserving life, because nowadays euthanasia is becoming more common, there are ordinary means and extraordinary means of preserving life. The ordinary means must always be used. This is air, water, and nutrition. These must be given a dying person in whatever way can conveniently be given to them. Whereas the extraordinary means of preserving life, and they're extraordinary because they're either so expensive or so painful, etc., these are never obligatory but only optional. Now, while these rules are very straightforward, black and white, the application of these principles to a specific case, oftentimes it's very gray. And that's why if you're ever in a position where you're having to take care of a loved one in their last days, always speak to a priest to make sure that you're not doing something that you could end up offending God by. There's another principle regarding the fifth commandment that applies with regards to drink and drugs. Here's the principle. God has given to us the use of our reason. That means you know the difference between right and wrong. And we therefore do not have the right to deprive ourselves deliberately of the use of reason without a very grave motive. Now, one case where it is a very grave motive to lose one's use of reason is, for example, let's say you're going into the hospital to have an operation. Of course, you take the anesthesia to knock you out. That's a legitimate reason. But no matter what your spouse is like, no matter what your kids are like, no matter what your boss at work is like, you're not allowed to get tipsy or drunk. So let's take a look at that. The relaxed feeling that comes from a little bit of alcohol in moderation, no problem with that. That you're complete control of your senses. Now, tipsiness. This is when you still know the difference between right and wrong, but it's getting sort of fuzzy. This is going to be venially sinful. Whereas drunkenness, drop down drunk, where you don't even remember what happened in that state, where you did really dumb things, etc., that's mortal because you lost the use of your reason. Likewise, the use of hard illicit drugs, which completely warp the mind, that will also be mortally sinful. When confessing sins of drunkenness and drug usage, you also need to confess how many persons were scandalized or how many persons were present, and in the case of drugs, if you shared those drugs with anyone else. What about smoking cigarettes and other kinds of tobacco? Normally, no sin involved. However, if there is a family history of lung disease, then it could become a sin of imprudence. Gluttony will almost always be a venial sin. Only in the case where one deliberately provokes frequent vomiting could this become mortally sinful because of the damage done to the esophageal tract. To give scandal to another, if it's with regards to grave matter, it will be a mortal sin. If it's with regards to slight matter, it'll be venially sinful. For example, the very typical case of immodest dress. If you wear something that is totally outrageous and meant to be provocative, of course you're committing a mortal sin. But if it's something that you're wearing that's just, it's not quite up to Catholic standards, but it's not totally outrageous either, this could be a venial sin. regarding the occasions of sin. You remember from your catechism that an occasion of sin is a person, place, or thing that more often than not leads you to offend God by mortal sin. Now, there is a grave obligation to avoid what we call the proximate occasions of mortal sin. In fact, to walk into an approximate occasion of mortal sin with your eyes wide open is already a mortal sin, even if you don't commit the sin itself. Let's give an example. Let's say that you're on a business trip and you know that when you stay at a motel, you normally turn on the TV set there and watch things that you shouldn't be watching. And you're really looking forward to turning that TV on this time. So there you are, you're reaching for the knob when suddenly lightning strikes and all the power in the whole motel goes out. Even though you haven't even turned on the thing that you wanted to see, you've already offended God by a mortal sin because you were willing to go into that proximate occasion of mortal sin itself. Now, while it is true that the occasions of sin will differ from person to person, especially because of age, gender, etc., nevertheless, there are certain things that are occasions of sin for many people. For example, television, when it's hooked up to the local channels or cable. Now, I specifically say that because if you don't have the TV hooked up to anything and you're using it just for DVDs, that does make it a lot safer because you've got more control over what you and your family are watching. Likewise, internet, when it doesn't have a blocker on it, easy occasion of sin. Bad companions, especially for young people, or going into a bar can easily be an occasion of sin for someone who's an alcoholic. Now, we will be speaking more about these occasions of sin and how to avoid them on Wednesday evening in sermon number 7. Anger is normally a venial sin. However, it could become mortal only in the case where there's real violence. Let's say two guys who are having a real punch 'em up, trying to break each other's bones. Yeah, that would become mortal. What about hatred? Hatred, in the theological sense, means wanting someone to burn in hell, which obviously would become a mortal sin against charity. However, usually when someone says, you know, I really hate so-and-so, what they usually mean is, I really dislike his guts, which is normally going to be a venial sin at the most. Now, abuse, whether it's physical, emotional, sexual, whatever, is always going to be offensive to God. Attempted suicide will be, by its nature, a mortal sin. However, oftentimes there is a lack of sufficient reflection or full consent of the will to make it subjectively mortal. What about mutilation? We're talking about tattoos and piercings here. This is normally going to be venially sinful. However, if the tattoo is, let's say, blasphemous or something that's immodest, then that would be mortal, and there would be an obligation to have the tattoo removed. Now, pierced ears for ladies is allowed by custom. Pierced ears for men are not. Nowadays, also, you get nose rings, you get tongue studs, you get belly button rings. These things are just gross. Going on to the 6th and 9th commandments. Thou shalt not commit adultery, and thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's wife. And here I'll try to be very discreet. But the principle is very important to understand, that God gave mankind the generative faculty, not primarily for our own personal satisfaction, but primarily for the continuation of the human race. And that's why any sins against these two commandments will by their nature be grave offenses because of the disorder from God's plan. As a result, as we've mentioned before, parents have a grave obligation to educate their children regarding these matters at the appropriate age so that the children can avoid offending God. Let's mention a few things about certain states of life. For those who are civilly divorced, they are forbidden to date because they're still married in God's eyes. Those who are allowed to date must avoid the unnecessary proximate occasions of mortal sin. For example, they must avoid being alone in private for a long time. They must also avoid prolonged signs of affection. And please remember that passionate kissing outside of marriage is a mortal sin. We should also mention what should be obvious is that shacking up, as they call it nowadays, is by its nature mortal, and also parents who allow their children to do this under their own roof are committing mortal sins also. Concerning married couples, please remember that the marriage debt is a grave obligation. To deliberately deny the marriage debt to one spouse will ordinarily be a mortal sin. It is true there are certain exceptions. Remember that if you did not intend to keep the vows that you made to God on the day of your wedding, you should not have got married in the first place. Concerning what is often called NFP or rhythm, it is prudent, though not strictly obligatory, to speak to one's confessor first. Remember what St. John Vianney, the Curé of Ars, had to say. Many women, he said, will go to hell because they did not bring into the world the children they should have given to it. Now, please remember that temptations are not sins. It may be helpful to confess temptations, but do mention in confession that they were only temptations, that you tried to fight them off. Also remember that desires are specifically different from thoughts. Regarding the object of desires or thoughts, the priest will always assume the opposite gender. If not, it must be confessed because this is part of the species, the kind of sin. Concerning looks, the first look will oftentimes be involuntary. You're walking down the street and you happen to notice someone. You can hardly avoid that. As long as you don't take the second glance, it's going to be simply a temptation. Whereas the second glance, yeah, that's voluntary. Regarding words, for example, jokes or boasting, one must also mention in confession how many persons were scandalized. Concerning actions, please remember that incomplete actions are also mortal sins. Please remember this. It must be confessed whether it was alone or with another. If it was with another, the priest will always assume someone of the opposite gender. If not, it must be specified this is part of the species of the sin. It must also be mentioned if it was with someone that you were related to, whether neither, one, or both were married. This is what makes the difference between fornication, two unmarried persons, single adultery, one married, the other unmarried, and double adultery, two married persons, but married to different parties. Also, anything that is unnatural, because this is part of the species, must be mentioned. However, please do not confess unnecessary details. Concerning modesty, there are two principles involved. The first principle applies to men and ladies, that we are never allowed to tempt others into temptation by the way we dress. And the second principle applies for ladies. A lady will want to guard her femininity, so she will want to dress ladylike, Mary-like. So, concerning the sin of immodesty, anything that is very tight or revealing, in any way provocative, yeah, that'll be mortally sinful. So please remember that parents are responsible for the way your teenage daughters dress at home or when they're living under your roof. Regarding dancing, dancing by its nature expresses joy, which is why certain kinds of dances can be okay. For example, square dancing, folk dancing, where it's just touching the hands, and as long as there's nothing else that could make it bad, normally, when you don't have one particular partner the whole night, you're changing persons the whole time, normally there's not going to be a problem about that. However, if there are any kind of dances that are immodest or provocative, we can use the word gyrations, obviously it's going to be sinful. Regarding music, take a look first at the lyrics. If the lyrics are promoting something that's bad, impurity, drugs, suicide, etc., of course you don't want to be listening to it. Regarding romance novels, and I'm not talking about Jane Austen, the Bronte sisters, but some of the modern junk out there, this oftentimes is going to be sinful because sometimes it's very bad, it can be venial, it can be mortal even, depending on how bad they are. Now, when you confess sins about these two commandments, the priest will always try to avoid asking questions. He'll only ask questions if it really is necessary for the validity of the sacrament. However, on your part as the penitent, no matter what your state of life is, whether you are single, dating, engaged, married, divorced, annulled, widowed, whatever, if you ever have a question about your state of life, whether something is sinful or not, always feel free to ask the priest, either in the confessional or outside the confessional even. The priest knows God's law, and he can discreetly explain to you what you need to know in order to save your soul. Starting with the 7th commandment, thou shalt not steal, and commandment 10, thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's goods. The principle here is that property belongs to its rightful owner, and any deliberate infringement of justice regarding rightful ownership demands what we call restitution. Now, there are two main sins against the 7th commandment. The first is stealing. Stealing is, of course, taking something that belongs to another, and the owner is reasonably unwilling for the object to be taken from him. Now, please note that we say that the owner is reasonably unwilling for the object to be taken away, because there are certain exceptions. For example, a parent. You should go through your children's wardrobe and also music collection and the reading material, etc., from time to time to make sure that there is nothing indecent there. And if you find that they have any immodest clothing or indecent music, literature, etc., you have the right to take it from them and destroy it, even if they've bought it with their own money. And so if teenage Johnny says, "But Mom and Dad, you're stealing from me because I bought that with my own money," no, go ahead and use your parental authority. To open the mail of another, to eavesdrop on a private conversation, or nowadays hacking into someone's computer will ordinarily be sinful. Again, the important exception of a parent concerning your minor children still living at home. If you suspect that your child is receiving mail or even email from someone that they should not be receiving it from, you as the parent may open your children's mail. Or if you know how to hack into your children's computers, go ahead and do it. Now, please note also, it's always okay to eavesdrop on your minor children who are still living at home. Doesn't that give you a sense of parental empowerment? Pirating CDs, DVDs, software, etc. will ordinarily be sinful because it is defrauding the manufacturer, even if it is a multi-billion-dollar corporation like Microsoft. Time wasted at work or sick time falsely claimed will also be sinful. A good way to make restitution for this is to put in extra time at work without claiming for it. If you have the intention to steal bit by bit and therefore eventually to get a large sum of money, it will be a mortal sin from the very beginning because of your intention. For example, if I take $5 out of the till today and $5 out of the till tomorrow, and I intend to make quite a bit of money this way, then from the very beginning, it's a mortal sin. There is also an obligation to pay our just debts, and this includes credit card debts. However, sometimes the only option left is bankruptcy. If you're ever in this position where you are thinking of declaring bankruptcy, it's always prudent to speak to your priest first to make sure that you're not doing something unjust. To cheat on a test or an exam, for example at school, will ordinarily be a venial sin, unless there are certain special circumstances which could render it mortal. For example, let's say that you win a $20,000 scholarship because you cheated on the entrance exam. Obviously, that would be a mortal sin. Regarding taxes, tax evasion, etc., I won't discuss this from the pulpit, but if you have any questions, you can always feel free to speak to a priest. The other sin besides stealing against the 7th commandment is unjust damage. This is deliberate damage, not simply something accidental. That's a different case. Deliberate damage. This will be mortal or venial, depending upon the damage that's done. Concerning the gravity of these two sins of theft and unjust damage, we can say that in New Zealand dollars, I would expect, you might want to ask your own priest about this. I know in the United States, we consider $150 going to be mortal sin by its very nature, which I think is approximately 200 New Zealand dollars. So that's probably pretty accurate. 200 New Zealand dollars would be grave matter, because that's still considered probably pretty good sum of money nowadays. If it's less than that, it would normally be venially sinful. However, you do need to take into account the circumstances of the owner. Because if the owner is genuinely poor, then of course this is going to make it a much graver sin more easily. For example, let's say that I steal $10 from someone who is genuinely poor. Yeah, I'm committing a mortal sin because that person needs those $10 to survive that day. Now, restitution is reparation made for theft or sins of unjust damage. If the original theft or damage was mortally sinful, then the restitution also obliges under pain of mortal sin. And if the original theft or damage was venially sinful, then the restitution obliges under pain of venial sin. So let's take the example. Let's say that you've stolen a candy bar that's worth $2. That's a venial sin, of course. Then you have an obligation under pain of venial sin to return the candy bar. Or if you've already eaten it, then you return $2 from the person you stole it from. And if you deliberately don't make restitution, you're committing another venial sin that needs to be confessed. So who do you make restitution to? If you know who the owner is, you must restitute to the owner, even if it is an insurance company that you've defrauded, or a business, or a family member, or whoever. If you still possess the stolen good, you must return it. If you no longer possess the stolen good, then you must return its equivalent, at least its monetary equivalent. However, please note that you are never obliged to say what you've done. You may simply make restitution as a donation or as a gift. For example, let's say that you've stolen money from your relatives, your parents or your brothers and sisters. You can simply give them something at Christmas time or for their birthday, saying, "Oh, I love you very much, Mom and Dad," etc. And you don't have to tell them what you ever did as when you were, let's say, when you were a child. Another case, let's say that you've stolen something like a CD or a DVD from a store. You can go back to the store and then buy a gift certificate for the amount of what you stole, and then take the gift certificate home, cut it up, shred it, whatever, so that it's destroyed and can't be used. That way you have anonymously got the money back to the proper owner without revealing what you've done. Now, only in the case where you really don't know who the owner was, or you don't know their present whereabouts, only in this case is it allowed to restitute to the poor. Now, I say to the poor because the church doesn't actually want to be looking like it's making money off of restitution. That's why, preferably, rather than sticking money in the Sunday basket, you give it to the poor if you had, let's say, a poor box available, or you could do it to the St. Vincent de Paul Society, etc., something along that line. You could even make a donation to, let's say, the foreign missions of the society, for example, their mission over in, like, India, for example. That way you're getting money to the poor in that way, rather than giving it to the church directly. Now, there are causes, however, that can excuse you from making restitution. For example, if the owner forgives you your debt, then of course you're not obliged to anything after that. The obligation of restitution can also be temporarily suspended in the case where making restitution would actually put you or your family in financial jeopardy. In this case, the ideal would be to restitute in segments. For example, to be able to give back $50 this month, $50 next month, etc., until you've paid it off. However, sometimes it happens that someone has really done some big sin against the seventh commandment. For example, if you've defrauded an insurance company to the tune of $20,000, well, who's got that kind of money in your pocket? Now, in which case, then you simply do what you can to make restitution, and then you pray to win the lottery. Lying is always sinful, mortal or venial, depending upon the damage that's done. Moreover, if you tell a lie to someone who has a direct right to the truth, for example, if you tell a lie to the boss about work-related things, or if you lie to your spouse about something that your spouse has a right to know, or if you are a child living at home still and you tell a lie to your parent, then there's also a sin against justice being committed. However, please note that it is okay to be evasive with someone who does not have the strict right to the truth. Let's give a couple examples to illustrate this. Let's say that you're a wife at home with your husband and the telephone rings. You pick it up and it's a telemarketer saying, "I'd like to speak to Mr. Smith, please." Now your husband's sitting right next to you, but you say, "I'm sorry, but Mr. Smith isn't at home right now." This is not a lie. Everyone knows what this means. It is simply a polite way of saying, he doesn't want to talk to you, get lost. As a result, this is not a sin. Please notice this. There's also another example that St. Alphonsus de Liguori gives in his moral theology. He gives the case. He says, let's say that you go over to someone's house for dinner and they've made dinner specially for you and it wasn't really very good. And they ask you, "Oh, how did you like my cooking?" You can say, he says, you can say, "It was wonderful," meaning for my mortification. As a result, this is not sinful. However, do please note that it is never allowed to tell a lie, a direct lie, under any circumstances. Let's go on to the 8th commandment now. Thou shalt not bear false witness against thy neighbor. The principle here is that everyone is entitled to his good name. Now, the gravity of sins against fraternal charity is weighed by the damage done to a person's reputation. So, if you deliberately destroy a person's reputation, then you've committed a mortal sin. If you simply damaged it without actually destroying it, you've committed a venial sin. Let's give a couple examples. So let's say that you go up to your friend and say, "Did you see that sailor? He was so drunk." Now, drunkenness is a mortal sin, and you are revealing a secret mortal sin of someone else. However, most of us would probably assume that a sailor is going to be drunk at least once in a while. As a result, you probably haven't destroyed his reputation. You may have damaged it somewhat. In this case, you're probably committing a venial sin. Whereas if you say, "I saw this priest and he was so tipsy." Now, tipsiness is going to be a venial sin. However, you might actually be destroying his reputation, in which case that could become a mortal sin. Now, there are two sins that are different here. One is called calumny, and the other is detraction. Calumny is sometimes what we call slander. This means telling lies about someone. Whereas detraction, what we usually refer to as gossiping, this means telling the unflattering truth about someone else unnecessarily. Now, please note I say unnecessarily, because there are times when it is appropriate for us to speak about the real faults of others. There are 3 cases in particular. First, it is allowed for a husband and wife to speak about anyone together, and it is not gossip. Please notice that. So you can speak about family, what's going on in the neighborhood, what's going on in your parish, what's going on at work, etc. This is not gossip. You are not offending God by this. You do want to avoid talking in front of the kids, obviously, and you also want to avoid any kind of bitterness, which could become venial. Now, the second case where it is okay to speak about the real faults of others is when you need to, as they say nowadays, vent to a discreet friend about something that's happening to you. In this case, you're not trying to destroy a person's reputation. You're trying to get some encouragement, get some advice how to handle the situation. Now, you do want to speak to someone who is discreet, because if you start talking to someone who is indiscreet, they're going to be blabbing about your problems to everyone. That's why you always want to think twice before taking someone of a sanguine temperament into your confidence, because sanguines can't keep secrets. Now, also, just as it's okay for you to speak about the real faults of another person to a discreet friend, likewise, it's okay for you to listen to someone else. If someone comes up to you and starts venting to you about what's going on at home or in their workplace or whatever, it is okay for you to listen to them in order to give them good advice how to handle the situation. The main thing is that you do not throw fuel on the fire. Let's say that it's a coworker and the coworker comes up to you and says, you know what the boss did to me? You don't want to be saying, yeah, and you know what he did to me too, because that's not helping the situation. Now, there's a third case also where it is okay to speak about the real faults of another. This is to prevent harm to a third party. So let's give a couple examples. First example, let's say that you're talking to your Novus Ordo friend about the crisis in the church, and you start talking about all the terrible things that Cardinal Mahoney of Los Angeles has been doing for the last 25 years. Even though you have taken away whatever reputation the Cardinal had to begin with, if any, nevertheless, you're not doing it for that reason. You're doing it to convince your friend of the truth of Catholic tradition. This, as a result, is not a sin against charity. This is an act of charity. Let's give another example. Let's say that you know that Joe Sixpack is a notorious womanizer, and you see your friend's daughter going out on a date with Joe. You can go to your friend and say, do you realize just what Joe is? And spill the beans. Even though you have completely trashed Joe's reputation, you're not doing it for that reason. You're doing it to protect the girl and her family. Again, this is an act of charity. Now, there are a couple rules concerning fraternal charity. We must judge people's actions. We must judge their behaviors, otherwise we're not living in the world of reality. However, while we must judge what they do, we must not judge their intentions, because only God can do that. And in that way, by judging people's actions but not judging their intentions, we remain in the world of reality, but at the same time we practice charity towards them. As St. Bernard of Clairvaux says, we should try to excuse a person's intentions even if we can't excuse what they've done. Concerning forgiveness, we must forgive our enemies from our heart, although there are times when it may be necessary for us to insist that they do make restitution for what they've done. Please note, though, that forgiveness, like any other virtue, is not a matter of the feelings. We don't have to feel good about someone who's done something terrible to us or our families. We simply have to want it. So the desire to forgive does count for forgiveness. That's why forgiveness, like any other virtue, can coexist with clenched teeth. Okay, Jesus, I forgive them, even if I don't feel like it. That is forgiveness.